Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1106 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. My guy Saturn really thought that he was smarter than the smartest man in the world. You hate to see it. Aside from this chapter being absolutely incredible, I also think that it's one of the most important chapters in the entire series. I'll justify this statement in a bit. I feel like Oda's kind of riding a thin line here, just because, look, I want the Gorosei and the world government to be a formidable opponent, and part of that is the feeling that they're actually competent. But this competency is probably a big component of this chapter that's just lurking under the surface. The world government is currently experiencing a disaster. Straight up right now, Saturn is memeing the hell out of himself because he is a fool. Yeah, let's just entrust half of our army to a guy who is very clearly our enemy, and nobody is even capable of fact-checking his work. Let's make sure that we emotionally torture this guy to the point where he's practically forced to betray us. I don't want you guys to get this twisted. I am really enjoying the memes right now. But going forward, I just kind of hope that the world government, the rest of the Gorosei after this, they learn something from it. That or this mistake proves incredibly costly, meaning immediate and drastic consequences. Because I do get the logic, I really do. They've been in power for a very long time. Those that are in power for this long, they get sloppy. And it seems like the only thing that Saturn really knows is how to rule by fear, at least when he is directly involved. I would assume that Saturn didn't think that Vegapunk would ever betray them because of fear of consequences, and maybe also his love for his job. Obviously, it's a fair mindset in the majority of circumstances, but what's happening here should be a wake-up call. Potentially a wake-up call with a massive amount of fallout. But we'll come back to this a little later in the review. But long story short is you can only underestimate the people of the One Piece world so much before it just becomes stupid. And it's clear as day that the enemies of the world government are growing in power exponentially. At some point, you've got to treat it seriously. I thought what Oda did with Vegapunk was incredible. We already know that Vegapunk had contempt for the world government spanning from over 20 years ago, but none of it ever led anywhere. Even looking now, and Vegapunk's two main instances of betraying the government, first researching the Void Century and then later with the Pacifista, both of those were, the goal wasn't to upend the established order. Researching the Void Century was Vegapunk's own personal curiosity, likely related to his drive for invention. And with Bonnie Man, Vegapunk never makes his grand speech about, making sure that they pay for their evil actions, putting a check on the government if ever they abuse their power, or having a goal of if they ever went too far, he would be their undoing. No, Vegapunk's motivation was far more human and personal. He simply couldn't allow the Pacifista to be the ones to kill Bonnie. His conscience wouldn't allow it. So at least partially, maybe Saturn's logic and understanding of Vegapunk was right. And I think that there's some commentary about that in the chapter. Like this chapter, I think made it more abundantly clear that Vegapunk didn't really believe in Nika. Like he said in this chapter, he had to see it to believe it. It's probably the same reason that Vegapunk never joined the revolutionaries. He just didn't have that hope. I think that he lacked the faith or the belief that the world government could actually be fought, despite befriending Kuma, a revolutionary and a missionary. But we kind of talked about this in the last chapter reaction. You can push somebody too far. Vegapunk was a slave in all but name. You could see the conflict escalate during the flashback. Saturn's increasing manipulation, forcing Vegapunk to compromise his moral integrity. But just the same as the residents of Kokoyashi Village, Nami's flashback, essentially slaves to Arlong, there comes a point to fight. Even if it's not really about winning, defeating your enemies, and surviving. When Arlong betrayed Nami and crushed her hopes that she could one day save the village, villagers just decided, F it, we'd rather die. And I think that Vegapunk's logic here was pretty much the same. He never wanted to erase Kuma's personality, but Kuma himself advocated for it, thinking, this is the way that I will save my daughter. So Vegapunk decided, if this deal is legitimate, then I will allow it because it is Kuma's wish. But if the government ever betrays Kuma's real heart's desire, then I have to stop them, even if it costs me my own life. And for me, it's so rewarding to see Kuma's kindness pay off like this. Never once does Kuma actually ask Vegapunk to betray the government, even if it would be something that he would actually want. It's just so painfully clear as you read the flashback that Saturn's main tool of getting anything done is manipulation, and it's in direct contrast to how Kuma and how Luffy operate. If Luffy is doing any manipulation whatsoever, it's just because he will do anything for his friends, he will sacrifice anything, and he earns the same treatment in return. The government can't grasp the concept that the best way to create loyalty is to have integrity. Even talking specifically about the Pacifista, they thought that the Pacifista was a good idea. The perfect soldier, right? Always dutifully fulfilling their orders with no regard to their own safety, or self. But a soldier who believes in nothing and stands for nothing and has no consciousness can be bought or acquired. The truth is that the world government could have had their super weapons and then, actually left Kuma's personality in there. But the reason that they didn't do this is because they feared that a weapon of this power having Kuma's personality would rebel against them. But looking at it now with the almighty power of hindsight, maybe it would have just been a better idea to be an organization that Kuma could actually believe in, desire to fight for. Perhaps earning loyalty rather than forcing loyalty is a good idea. But that's just me though. It's honestly crazy. I feel like I say this on a week-by-week basis, but Oda does an amazing job at being creative. The Vegapunk Pacifista Order 66 theory was one of the first ones that I ever covered on my channel, one of the first ones that ever blew up. Essentially, the idea at the time was that Vegapunk might be associated with, or an actual revolutionary army member, and that he programmed all the Pacifista to turn on the government at some designated point in time, similar to the clone army from Star Wars, Order 66. This chapter essentially confirmed that theory. But at the same time, it feels so dang wrong just because of the context behind it all. The same basic events feel so different because Vegapunk isn't a revolutionary trying to take down the world government. None of this is self-righteously about him or his own desires. Because to me, it seems like Vegapunk's main desire is to live and to invent. Vegapunk's main frustration in his life is not all the evil stuff the world government is doing, but the lack of resources to be able to create. So like I said, I don't think that anything here is about Vegapunk himself. This is a great sacrifice because he was content with the world as it is and his place in it. It's almost as if a little bit of Kuma rubbed off on Vegapunk. Being around him for so long, Kuma was so self-sacrificing. He proved without a shadow of a doubt that there is nothing that he would not give. And I think that seeing that was powerful. Vegapunk is an incredibly smart guy. He knew what would happen when his betrayal was revealed. And this isn't a play which increases the power of some great faction in the world of One Piece. No, Vegapunk gave all of this power to literally a little girl who suddenly has one of the strongest armies on the entire planet, which is just chaotically hilarious, awesome, and also a little frightening. But yeah, out of all the dozens of theories about the Pacifista out there, man, nobody called this. At least not until very, very recently. And it's a testament to how creative it is. And also a little bit of Oda's sleight of hand. We didn't really know that Jewelry Bonnie and Kuma had a relationship, that she was his daughter, until recently, which is kind of an important piece to how all of this came together. With a story like One Piece ongoing for 20 years, sometimes the community has a little bit too much time to think about what's happening and to take it creatively. You guys already know I'm really guilty here. But thinking a lot about it, man, I just can't hold fans like myself responsible, passionate fans, for thinking about the series and being excited enough for what will happen and to speculate. And a masterful way to combat that is to, yes, everything that we knew before was true, but you're missing something. I just want you guys to know that it's easier said than done. And what Oda's accomplished here is remarkable. But yeah, guys, I think that this chapter might legitimately be a big turning point in the series. After this, nothing will be the same across the whole One Piece world. Oda set our expectations of Egghead early on that this would become a huge incident, and I'm really starting to see it. For approximately 1,000 chapters of this story, the Gorosei's main concern, whenever we see them talking, one of the big talking points is always the balance of powers. Even up till recently, the Gorosei justified the loss of the Chichibukai because of the addition of the Seraphim. But in my mind, this has now become a major identity for the entire Egghead arc. The balance of powers isn't just tipping. It's being shattered into a million pieces. The government has lost the warlords. They have lost the Pacifista. I'm still not convinced that they end up keeping the Seraphim. Garp, the hero of the Marines, loses to Blackbeard, a pirate. After Kobe, the current hero of the Marines, also lost to the same pirate, Blackbeard, sort of. And then a current sitting admiral, the strongest warriors of the Marines, most likely will end up losing to Luffy. Cypherpole and CP0 isn't doing much better. Vegapunk, the leading scientist responsible for most of the advancements of the world government's technology and powers, lost. And oh yeah, there's also a Gorosei here who most likely is going to take a reputation hit that will be difficult to overcome. To me, it's almost as if Oda designed Egghead so that every arm of the government, all of their powers, they would have some sort of representative of each of these take an L, to completely and totally undermine the world government's hold over the world. We were talking before about how the world government seemed incompetent. That may be precisely the point. While we as fans may be thinking it, the people of the One Piece world should be thinking the same. The cherry on top of all of this is if, because of the events here, Akainu finally decides enough is enough. While the Gorosei through the course of the story have been talking over and over about the balance of powers, Akainu always talks about the reputation of the Marines. He's even directly accused the Gorosei of undermining his efforts. So I wonder what he'll think about all this. Does the government need the Marines more than the Marines need the government? And yes, I do think that that's possible. And we do have a curious encounter between Kuma and Akainu as Kuma was heading to Egghead. Basically, guys, it looks like the world government as we know it is finished. What happens after all of this is undoubtedly going to be wild. I'm predicting me some chaos. And just the thought of it brought this chapter to another level for me. I really think that we're about to see the game for the throne. If people thought that crossing the world government was a fool's errand before, I doubt that they will still have that mindset. And if it wasn't time for the great cleansing before, it will be now. I just have it in my mind that Big News Morgan's such an amazing character, honestly, but he's going to report all of this in some form or fashion. And I really think that Kuma's ultimately going to become the symbol, which sparks rebellion everywhere. Kuma as his tragic slave inspires everybody to unshackle themselves. The lead up to all of this was already that the world government was stretched too thin. They couldn't deal with the Yonko at the same time that they were trying to deal with the warlords. And instead of stabilizing, it appears like it is going to get worse. The world government is vulnerable, and everything that I think that this is going to inspire, they're not going to be able to deal with it. But it is truly crazy to think about how much power Big News Morgans has right now. His pen game pretty much determines the future, because people need to know what happened here, and if they don't know what happened here, it could change how they respond to it. I'm personally assuming that Big News Morgans cannot withhold himself from this scoop. The truth is what brings out the most in the Egghead incident, but we'll see. But there's another side to this coin that I think is interesting as well. It's easy to assume this is what we've been rooting for the whole time, and yes, it is to an extent, but what we're about to see is just total anarchy. In my opinion, the people around the world will essentially have to pick their side, and in the absence of a unifying leader, most people will choose their own, and many people will choose themselves. We all hate the government, right? We can all agree on that. At the same time, they did a lot in order to create stability and safety. Without their influence encouraging some amount of law and order, we are going to see a whole lot of death. Not just from the actual players, but to the innocent civilians. But I also thought that this was the absolute perfect chapter to highlight Luffy as Nika. Honestly, guys, that was my favorite part of the chapter. Bonnie realizing that Luffy is Nika. I feel like I say this every week, dude, but that shit made me tear up. But I think that you can think of this event in Egghead as probably about to shatter the world into tiny pieces. So it's Luffy's job to bring the pieces back together. We haven't even talked about the Giants of Elbaf yet, but they recognize Luffy as Nika. I don't think that they're gonna be the only group that does. Luffy has great unifying powers by nature, but it just seems like where a lot of this is headed. I think it's very probable that Luffy ends up with more allies that he's not totally aware of. And I think that this also further justifies Blackbeard's presence during this arc as well. Suddenly it's a question about who will take control. But yeah, I feel like I'm talking all over the place. Let's take some deep breaths. There are a ton of thoughts to unpackage. If Saturn isn't killed during the course of this arc, he might just straight up be killed by Emu and the rest of the other Gorosei. This failure seems pretty monumental. And when you're talking about characters dying, obviously you have to talk about the Stella Vegapunk. Strangely enough, his death didn't make me feel a lot in the chapter, and I thought that I would, but I really didn't. And I don't think it's because I believe that he won't die, because I really think that he will. Honestly, this has been a thought that I've had since the very beginning of the arc. My initial headcanon was that every Vegapunk alter would die except for Lilith, who would continue traveling with the Strats. But maybe what I'm feeling is in some way related to this, like with Kuma, for instance. Kuma is most likely going to die. In fact, I honestly believe that he is already dead. But I would say that I'm not really feeling the impact of that right now. And that's not to say that we won't get it in the future. Both for Kuma and for Dr. Vegapunk, they could have like a Whitebeard moment. The chapter intended to be a final goodbye. But once again, despite sort of expecting this, it's still complicated. Because while he's dead, there's so many pieces of him which remain. Obviously, the Pacifista aren't quite right, but with something like the Seraphim Kuma, you feel like He's just getting another chance at life. So yeah, the Stella might die, but I don't think that all of the Vegapunk alters are gonna die. They are essentially clones. And in a way, this might give someone like Lilith a more complete existence. For the first time, Lilith will have to individually decide what it is that she wants to do. So this, in a way, frees her, which I find to be fitting. But this, of course, assumes that the Stella will die. There is no guarantees in the story of One Piece that anybody will ever die. But I definitely do see some parallels between Kuma and Vegapunk. Their stories here seem to be playing out in the same way. But if there's anything from this chapter that I think might be disappointing to some people, not everybody, just slightly, is I think a lot of people were getting really excited that Bonnie might potentially join the Straw Hats. And I think that the reveal here makes that really, really unlikely. With the addition of the Pacifista, not just here in Egghead, but potentially around the world, gives Jewelry Bonnie one of the strongest pirate crews in the entire world. I really doubt that Jewelry Bonnie is going to abandon the Pacifista, and I really doubt that the Strats are going to continue to adventure with an army of Pacifista by their side. Maybe for a short time, but certainly not forever. I just see this playing out that Jewelry Bonnie joins the Grand Fleet. So I know that a lot of people, myself included, were starting to get excited about the idea of Jewelry Bonnie potentially joining the crew, but that's kind of how it's been lately with Nakama theories. But this might be for the best. Since the end of Wano, when literally nobody joined out of all the possible candidates that felt like had been set up for many chapters, Yamato, Momonosuke, and Carrot, I've kind of had the impression that the crew is full. Each additional strat added to the crew just means that Oda has to do more. There's something to be said about the strats that we currently have getting the amount of story time that they deserve, and everybody else is arc specific or needed for the final battle. But it's a serious question as to like what happens next. Obviously, we should be expecting Elbaf. It'd be very disappointing if we didn't get that arc. But does Bonnie and any of the Vegapunks go with them? With Bonnie now having the power to control the Pacifista, it makes me start to think that we might get a parting of ways, and that would provide any of the Vegapunks with an option of where to go next. Vegapunk traveling with Bonnie but not with the Strats does make a lot of sense to me. Sometimes I think certain characters know too much, and Vegapunk is one of those characters. It might be more exciting to adventure Elbaf without him. And this is probably a good segue into the Giant Warrior Pirates. I thought that it would be Jaguar D. Saul rather than the Giant Warrior Pirates, but I'm claiming a dub on this one. Giants arriving to Egghead made a ton of sense to me. If for no other reason than they had a connection to Vegapunk, we already knew that Big News Morgans had spread the news around the world, so everybody knew what was happening in Egghead. It had lasted for over a day, and Elbaf is nearby. Once again, sometimes Oda cooks at just insanely godlike levels. You better believe it is not a coincidence that when the Strats first met Dory and Brogy, it was at Little Garden, an island stuck in time, basically an island of the past. And here we see them again reintroduced to the Strats in the future island Egghead. Along with Egghead being the literal island of the future that is based on technology of the past, all of this is just, I'm sure that Oda cooked it all up, man. In my opinion, this is a brilliant decision. Mainly a brilliant decision to save time. If we'd gone to Elbaf, then there would undoubtedly be a scene where we would meet Dory and Brogy, and that reunion would have to be a moment. Getting that moment now is one, awesome, but two, means that we can start Elbaf a little bit faster. This feels to me a lot like Jinbei and the Sun Pirates at the end of Whole Cake Island. They'll help the Strats by opening a path to escape, but in order to do this, they might have to stay behind, which would delay them, and ultimately give Oda one less thing to do when we begin Elbaf. And it's also just a fantastic way to begin to plant thoughts about Elbaf in our mind. Did anyone else read this chapter and start to think a lot more about the Giant Warrior Pirates? I wonder if their disappearance was actually a big deal in terms of the status quo of the New World. I know that a lot of the fandom isn't the most impressed with them, mainly because we saw them in Little Garden and that was so early on in the story pre-timeskip, it's really easy to underestimate them. But Dory and Brogy had actually been fighting each other every day for 100 years, with no rest. So I'm just saying it may not be a good idea to underestimate them, and certainly with their introduction here in this chapter, I have never been more hyped for them. Not many pirates can survive in the New World, and the Giant Warrior Pirates is the most ancient pirate crew that we know of. They were never defeated. So in a way, as we begin Elbaf, Oda has to work against the precedent of the story that came before, right? Like, we already have an impression of the Giants that doesn't necessarily match up with how the island of Elbaf and the Giants as a race has been hyped up. As far as islands that the world government could never conquer, we basically have Wano and Elbaf. Big Mom was under the impression that if she made an alliance with the Giants of Elbaf, then it would allow her to become Pirate Queen. So to see some feats from them leading into that arc serves a purpose. We're about to travel to the strongest island in the world. But yeah, obviously guys, there's a ton of speculation here and a lot of things could potentially happen. I'm just really excited to see how it all plays out. The chapter itself was incredible. With Luffy going Gear 5th here, the impact of it was so much greater. I almost wish that he hadn't gone Gear 5th before. If there's any criticism at all of Egghead, which there really shouldn't be, but if you were to be really nitpicky, it's just like, I feel like somewhere in the middle the arc got a little bit stalled, right before the flashback with Kuma. Then once Kuma arrived, the arc basically got reset. In retrospect, a lot of the fighting that was taking place was filler. As far as Kizaru is concerned, nothing that happened here is surprising. Do I think that Kizaru could have killed anyone and anything at any point during this arc? Yeah, I really do think that he could have, but he hasn't, and I don't think that he will. Really, for me, it's just a question of what does Oda intend for his final moment to be in this arc. Maybe if the Blackbeard Pirates are here and they finally decide to do something, Kizaru can resolve himself to actually accomplish something, or at least genuinely try. But yeah guys, with that being said, I think that that's what I had to say today. To me, this chapter changes everything, and I am waiting with bated breath to see exactly in which ways. But as always, I'm curious as to what you guys think. Whether you noticed something from the chapter that I might have missed, just share your thoughts. Remember, check out my books, The Booms, links in the description. If you guys happen to read it, please leave a review and let other people know what you think about it. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always guys, have a wonderful day.